I'm gonna give people a minute to get in here and make sure everything is working properly. But I think we are live. As you are coming in, feel free to say hello and let me know if you can hear me. We'll get started in just a minute. Alright, well, I am going to start introducing myself, and if more people come in, again, feel free to say hello in the comments. Let me know if there's any issue with the sound or anything, definitely, but I am going to be talking about aggression today from a force-free perspective. So, my name is Sarah Bond. I am a certified professional dog trainer, knowledge and skills assessed, as well as a certified dog behavior consultant through IAABC. I've been training since 2008. I started my career at PetSmart and then eventually moved on to work for a service dog organization and then my own business where I focus on behavior cases as well as taking on basics, and I also do service dog training. So aggression is one of my favorite topics and I'm excited to talk about it today. I will leave some time at the end for questions if anyone does have questions, but I just wanted to kind of start by talking about what aggression is and why it's important to look at it from a force-free angle. So the definition of aggression is a little bit tricky because we hear people use words like reactive a lot, or sometimes they'll say that the dog is aggressive. And what we really want to keep in mind, first of all, is that aggression is a behavior, not a personality trait. So it is important to kind of not label the dog as an aggressive dog, but look at the behaviors that are aggressive the dog is displaying. That really helps, I think, a lot of people not think of their dog as a bad dog, but a dog who is doing a behavior that maybe is undesirable to them. But in many cases, it's totally natural. And that is really the case with a lot of aggression. It is communication. It's the dog trying to say, maybe I want space or I feel threatened in this situation. It can also be trying to get access to or guarding resources. Those are common reasons that aggression will happen. Fear is a big element for a lot of dogs in this. But of course, there are other reasons that a dog can act aggressively. And there is always the potential for harm with aggression. And we can't really know the intention of the dog because we can't speak to them, but we can kind of, take the facts that we see and think, okay, what am I seeing here? Does it seem like this dog is just trying to kind of scare me away, or is this dog actually thinking I'm going to come over and bite you, for example? And again, we don't know that. So there is kind of a gray area where we can say, I don't know if this is really an aggressive behavior, but personally, I generally use the word when it seems like there is potential for harm to happen. So that is kind of where I define it. And again, thinking about it as a form of communication that is fairly natural to the dog, just something that we as humans don't want to happen for obvious reasons because it can be dangerous, and also making sure that we define it as a behavior. All right, so force-free training to me, I think it means something a little bit different to different people, but in general, the things that I'm always thinking about when I'm thinking about I want to make sure I'm being force-free when I'm training, I do want to make sure that I'm avoiding things that are aversive to the dog. So if something is unpleasant for the dog or scary for the dog, I definitely want to be avoiding using that in my training. Generally, I'm never going to intentionally use something like that. Does that mean that nothing aversive will ever happen during a training session? We can't always avoid like maybe a loud sound or something happening, but our intention is always to make sure we're avoiding that. I also want to train cooperation. I want the dog to be willingly participating in the training. I never want to be making them train if they don't want to train. So we want to make the training exciting and engaging enough where the dog is willing to be part of it, and we can set them up to be successful. I'm also really big on offering choice when possible. So there are situations when maybe we have to kind of guide them towards a particular choice, but in general, I think choice is a really valuable reinforcer and something that all organisms are value to some extent. So being able to choose even something as simple as which treat is more reinforcing to me, or which direction I want to walk on a walk, can be really valuable, but especially when we get into dogs who are not feeling as confident as they should, which a lot of dogs who are displaying aggression may be displaying some fearful behaviors. They might be anxious, they might be insecure about the situation, and might be having trouble trusting. So I think that's important to keep in mind, and being able to give them some choices can really help build that confidence. Of course, I'm always thinking about the focus being based in positive reinforcement. I want the dog to be getting reinforced for behaviors that I want, so those are the choices that they make. And that does work also with aggression. I think there's a kind of a common misconception that aggression needs to be punished, or that it needs to be something that we kind of like tamp down. But really what we're wanting to do is change the underlying reason for the aggression and help the dog understand better behaviors to replace the ones that we don't want. So we'll get more into that in a minute. But let's talk about that for a second, about some of the common kind of misconceptions about aggression. Punishment is something that is probably going to look like it's working in the moment because it's going to suppress and stop the behavior right then for a lot of dogs. But what's actually, a concern, and what we're thinking about there is maybe the behavior stops in that moment, but is the dog actually feeling better about the situation? Are they getting a chance to be more comfortable with whatever the thing that they are aggressing towards is, whether it's another dog or a person, a cat, whatever the trigger or the target of that aggression is, are they made to feel better or worse by what we're doing? So it is really, really important that we think about that, because the fallout, if we're creating negative experiences, is not going to help us in the long run with the aggressive behavior. We may actually suppress some of the warning signals that they're trying to give before they do things like bite. So I'm a really big proponent of not using any punishment with aggression. I think it's extremely important, at least not any traditional, punishment. We can get into the science of what's punishment and what's not, but definitely we want to be looking at it from a perspective of, we don't want to just stop this behavior and suppress it. We actually want to change the behavior. And that's going to take some positive reinforcement and some, creative thinking a little bit sometimes. The advantages to working from a force-free perspective to aggression, one of them is just, I think personally, a better quality of life for the dog. If you're worried about punishment, there is definitely more stress involved in that, and I think it can cause some issues. So, quality of life is huge. I also think it can help build a stronger relationship between the dog and the people that they live with, which in many of the aggression cases I work, the relationship has become very strained. There's damage to the relationship, especially if the dog has attacked another animal in the home or a person in the home. Those are the cases in particular where the trust has kind of been broken, and sometimes that can really make a huge impact on that relationship. So here are my big rules. First of all, I think the most important one is that there should be safety in place for everyone. So I think we think a lot about safety with aggression as we don't want the dog to bite someone. But really, what I'm thinking about when I think about safety is both the dog and the human should feel as safe as possible. I don't want anyone to feel unsafe or like something bad is going to happen. So we need to have that trust there. We need to make sure that we're setting it up where everybody feels comfortable. And if we are having an issue with that trust, which does sometimes happen, then part of the training should be focused on kind of repairing that relationship and going at a pace where the person and the dog can both be comfortable. And I have had a few cases where one member of the family has become really fearful of the dog after some aggressive behavior. And so we really, really want to make sure that not only are we protecting them from getting bitten, but we're also helping them feel safe during the training. It is just as important that the dog feels safe, because if the dog doesn't feel safe, they're a lot more likely to feel like they need to defend themselves. So it is very, very important that we set up the situation where the dog is not going to feel a lot of pressure, where they're going to feel comfortable and like everything is safe for them in that situation. One of the ways that I will set that up is distance. Depending on the situation, if the dog is uncomfortable with something that is happening around them, I want to have them at as much distance as I can so that they are under a point where they are feeling really stressed. I want them to notice the trigger, whatever that is, and we'll talk about that more in a second, but I also want them to feel safe in that situation. And then on the side of humans feeling safe and being safe, I think that there are lots of tools that we can utilize there, including things like the dog being on leash during a session. Basket muzzles can be an awesome option as long as we teach the dog they're a good thing. We definitely don't want to just put a basket muzzle on and go. We want to make sure that we spend some time desensitizing and counter conditioning the dog to think that the basket muzzle is awesome to put on. So that is something else that we want to kind of be paying attention to, or options like that. I definitely have used, pens and baby gates and things as well, tethers. But again, anything that we use, we want the dog to be super comfortable with and feel like they are, in a safe place. We never want them to feel trapped or like they need to, try to increase distance or, get a threat away from them. So that is some of the important stuff about safety. And that's really, I think, honestly, my first thing that I always look at is the safety. Management is vital to prevent more issues from happening while we're working on this. And I talk quite a bit to my students in the first session about the best way to set up management for them and what's going to be the safest situation for them and their dog. All right, so the other thing that I really like to think about is having compassion for the human learner in the situation, because we come in as dog trainers and we're usually looking at the dog. We're trying to change the behavior of the dog. We're trying to, help them feel better. We're trying to help them get to a better place mentally, as well as we're trying to help them, offer better behaviors. But what we, I think, a lot of times miss is we also have to think about the using positive reinforcement with the people too. First of all, we have to think about shaping the people as well. Sometimes it's hard to go from what you're used to a new method right away. And that doesn't mean I'm going to use methods I'm not comfortable with, but it does mean that I'm going to help them understand how to get to the point that I'm at their pace, as much as I can safely, where the dog is still feeling safe and everything is still okay. So I see a lot when I'm working with students, and I talk to a lot of dog trainers about this as well. We tend to, in our heads, think, well, why did they do that thing that we don't like? And it's hard as humans not to be a little bit judgmental when we see something that we know is the wrong decision. But we have to remember that most of the people that we're working with, maybe this is their first dog, maybe they have, been misinformed about the best way to handle these situations. We are here to help them. And so I don't think it ever benefits us to be judgmental with the client. So I never come in and tell my clients, what you did in the past is what messed up your dog, or what you have done was wrong. I always come in and look at it and get the history from them and say, okay, here's what we want to do moving forward. Here's what's going to help you and your dog. And I think that's really, really vital. When we're looking at this from a force-free perspective, we should be force-free with the people too. So obviously, like I said, safety is number one, but we also want to make sure that everyone is able to have some trust in this process. And, I think it helps a lot if you can build a little bit of a relationship with that student. All right. So The other things that I think are really vital when you're setting up a behavior plan for aggression, keep it simple. We know, the more time you spend, I think, as a dog trainer or behavior consultant, the more information is in your head. And I find myself sometimes wanting to like tell them why I'm doing something, or like a huge long explanation of what's happening. And generally that overwhelms most people. You do sometimes get those students who really want to learn and really want to pick up everything that you're telling them, will read books that you recommend. I love those students, but that's not every student. Some of them just want help with their dog. They just want their dog to, do what they'd like them to and not bite them. So in those cases, especially, I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. I'm going to give them 1 or 2 things to work on. They're going to be really straightforward. They're going to be really easy exercises, and we're going to make sure that they can fit it into their day pretty naturally. That, combined with the management, should help them see progress pretty quickly in the majority of cases. Setting realistic goals is also really important. And I think that what I see frequently is I'll go into a home and the family will say, we wanted a dog that we could take to restaurants and sit on the patio with. We wanted a dog we could take to the dog park, and their dog is attacking other dogs or barking at kids. And I have to kind of say, do you think that your dog wants to do that? Because it is vital that we are thinking about the dog feeling comfortable in those situations. And is the dog going to get to the point where they're better? Absolutely. But can we say they're going to get to the point where they're going to be able to then go to a dog park and play with other dogs that are strange dogs? Not necessarily. That is not the right fit for every single dog. So we do have to kind of be aware of that and be paying attention to what is the ideal situation for this dog and what do we think we're looking at. And I do go through a prognosis with most of my clients, and I got that that originally from doing a class with Michael Shikashio, and he has lots of great resources, of course, on aggression, but I go through things with the clients like, what is their commitment to the training? What is the intensity of the behavior that's happening? How frequent is it? How predictable is it? I think, we also have to look at things like, how much investment have they already put into this emotionally, financially, all of those things, and what more are they willing to put into it, and what are their goals? If their goals are not realistic, I want to kind of take a step back and say, if we can only get to this point, will that be enough for you? And those are things that we have to kind of consider with these cases sometimes. But I do always want to do what's best for both the client and the dog. I think that's vital. So defining success can be part of that too. If we can tell them, I see your dog making progress in this area, and that's success. I think it helps a lot. When you're with a dog every single day, it's hard to see that they're making progress. So I will come in for the sessions that I'm doing and look and say, look at how your dog this week is able to get a lot closer to the other dog and stay completely relaxed. That's a lot of progress. And I want them to really understand that and understand that they are moving towards success and that it's not a straight line. There's going to be ups and downs, but I do see progress when I come in. And that is always my goal. If we're not seeing progress, then I'm probably going to adjust my training plan. All right. So, and then I look at the basics of training. I want to make sure that I'm thinking, what's the antecedent to this behavior? What do I want the behavior to be? What am I going to do after the behavior to reinforce it? So those are all things that I sit down and consider, and I give them specific behaviors, and we talk about what those antecedents are for the behavior, what the triggers are, what is causing the behavior to start, and seeing if we can manage those as part of the situation. Can we avoid walks in the busy neighborhood for a while until the dog is doing better with dogs and people, for example? And I think the last thing that I kind of want to mention here before we talk about some of the methods that I use is that the learner gets to decide what's aversive and what's reinforcing. So we don't get to decide as the trainer. If that dog thinks that a harness is terrible, that harness for them is aversive. So we can try to make it better if it's something that's necessary for some reason, but generally my preference is to find another option. So if I can find an option that works better for that dog, that is reinforcing instead of aversive, or at least we're starting from a neutral place that we can create a better association, that makes a huge difference. And I know, even one of my own dogs who I've had since she was a puppy is really uncomfortable with harnesses being put on. So I have been switching her over to just walking on a collar because she can walk really nicely. But we did have to do some training to get her to that point. And I also, am really careful about making sure she's not pulling on that and doing anything to her neck. So it is something that we have to look at that. And I've for sure seen dogs who are not nearly as reinforced by, for example, the food that they're being given as the food that I have. And so then we have to talk about that. Or maybe food is not that reinforcing for them in certain situations. So that usually means the dog is kind of overwhelmed or overstimulated, but sometimes it can be that we need to find a more effective reinforcer for that dog. I've definitely used things like movement, like having them run a little bit with me, getting to sniff certain areas, getting to explore different things. Play can certainly be a great one for a lot of dogs. So there's many options for reinforcement. I always start with food, but if we find that's not as effective as we want it to be, I will mix in other things as well for the dog if we see that certain things are really exciting for them and really make them want to work to get those options. So I want to talk about some of the common techniques that I use when I'm working with aggression. There are a few that I use, and I definitely will tailor it a little bit to each dog, but I do have kind of just a set repertoire that I start with. One of the most common things that I do is teach a classically conditioned redirection cue. So I usually use the word here, but I have had clients use lots of different words and sounds. And I basically start by classically conditioning that word to equal their absolute favorite thing in the world. So I will have the person cut up some, boiled chicken or string cheese or something that their dog maybe doesn't usually get. For a lot of dogs, that's enough. If they tend to get a better diet, than that, they tend to get really high value things already, then we might have to go even, more up to tripe or something. But we're starting with whatever is really already reinforcing for the dog and what's something that they're gonna kind of only get for the really good stuff. So we start with that, we say the word, we pair that with the food, and that's the first several sessions. It's just saying the word, offering food next to your leg. And then as the dog is doing that pretty successfully, we start to add in a little bit of distance, a little bit of distractions, so that if you're out on a walk, for example, and the dog sees another dog and we see them start to kind of fixate and stare, we can say here and have the dog whip back around to get their reward. So I think that when we are thinking about things like that, it obviously is a cue where they're doing something, but it's something really simple. And that's part of my philosophy with this, is keep it super simple. So all we have to do is teach the dog, this word is awesome, and the best things are gonna appear next to my side when you hear it. It's so easy to learn in the beginning, and then we just add in distractions a little at a time until they can handle it around triggers at a distance, and then closer and closer. I also frequently use engage, disengage, or look at that, which are similar techniques but have a few differences. They're both excellent. I definitely use that a lot with having the clients, have the dog look at the potential trigger, marking that behavior, and then reinforcing to kind of get them doing the head swivel back and forth a little bit. And I think that behaviors like this and the here can, even though they are operant, we're teaching them to do an actual behavior that has a consequence of I get something good. There is some classical conditioning that happens here too, because they're looking at that potentially scary or negative thing, and then something really awesome is happening. So I think that we kind of get, a little bit of both happening. They kind of combine together like they frequently do when we're doing this kind of training. And one thing I always tell my clients with this when we're talking about aggression is we're not just trying to teach them a different behavior, we're also trying to change the underlying emotional state. So if that dog is afraid of other dogs, I want them to start to move towards other dogs are fine, they're not gonna hurt me. And eventually, maybe other dogs are great, but we wanna get to neutral, and then we can start working towards positive. If we can make the other dogs not a threat, that dog is going to have a much more comfortable life and be able to do a lot more things. So it's a quality of life issue as well. but we do want to start to change that underlying emotional state as much as we can, and I help them with that by pointing out body language. So that's another thing that I'm really frequently doing when we're working on these situations, is we're doing a lot of looking at what body language is your dog showing right now. Where is their tail? Where are their ears? And I'm pointing things out to them as we go so that they start to notice those things. A lot of people are not super aware when their dog is staring at something even. And so I'll say, hey, I would like you to not have your dog stare for more than 2 or 3 seconds before you try to redirect them and call them back. And the dog will sit there and look for like several seconds before they think about doing it. So I have to kind of time it for them sometimes in the beginning to help them figure out the right timing. I'll let the dog look for a couple seconds and say, okay, now. And I'll just say yes if they're using that verbal marker, or click for them even a couple times in the beginning so that they start to make the connection. But body language is huge. I want to see relaxed, calm body language. If we're seeing a lot of stress signals, if we're seeing a lot of tension, I'm usually going to increase the distance to help everybody feel more comfortable. My goal is that the dog never reacts during the session. Sometimes it happens, occasionally we get a little too close by accident, or the other dog, or the person that's on the other side of our process here does something that we're not expecting. But generally, if we set it up correctly, we can keep them in a pretty good place and kind of push up against that threshold to make it, higher. Another method that I will use sometimes, I frequently like to use Dr. Karen Overall's protocol for relaxation. I find it super, super helpful for a variety of problems, especially issues that come out of overstimulation or overarousal. But I in general, I use it a lot with adolescent dogs, but I do love using it with a lot of my aggression cases. And I find that it can make a huge difference in the dog being able to be kind of still, even if they're not fully relaxed yet. I think if we can get them to kind of that stillness while things are happening around them, and then, over time, that can turn into a little bit more relaxation is what I've seen. Kind of a fake it till you make it. Even if you're not actually relaxed yet, if you're just kind of hanging out there while things are happening, and we've paired that with good stuff like you do in the protocol, I think it makes a huge difference. So I highly recommend using Dr. Overall's protocol. I think it's wonderful. I have also used Suzanne Clothier's relaxation protocol, and I like that one as well for some dogs. I think I use that a little bit more with like puppies, but I definitely have had some adult dogs and some dogs with aggression who it really benefited as well. So I kind of see which one would be a better fit for each dog sometimes, but I think in general, relaxation protocols can be a great choice. And then I like to teach some different behaviors that I think are useful. So if it's a dog who's afraid of people, for example, we're going to start with something like treat and retreat, where I'm tossing the treat kind of behind the dog so they don't feel like they have to come closer to me. So they can see the treat, go get it. I'm going to toss the treat again, 2 are behind them, until they are feeling more comfortable and confident. So that's kind of stage 1 with most of my dogs that are not comfortable with humans. And some dogs that warms them up immediately, some dogs it takes, multiple sessions to get to the point where they're comfortable coming up to me. It just really depends on the dog and what's going on. But when I'm doing that, I'm always thinking about being really non-threatening, not facing them down directly, not leaning over them, not reaching out towards them. So once they are more comfortable, once they are getting to a point where they are able to approach me a little bit, one of the first behaviors I'll work on is a hand touch. I just want the dog to tap my hand with their nose. It's really simple. It's not very threatening for most dogs. It gives them the control because they get to come over and interact with your hand. And it starts to create a much better association with hands. It's also great for nippy puppies because it keeps their mouth closed, but especially I think for a dog who maybe is fearful or anxious or just generally not feeling secure and comfortable, letting them make the choice to come up and do that hand touch is a really powerful option. If they work up to that point and we're continuing to work on more, my next step after the hand touch is sometimes a voluntary chin rest, where I have my hand out and the dog, is going to place their chin on it. And I generally do both of those before I go to any version of petting. I'm not going to pet a dog until it is really comfortable with me and comfortable doing some kind of structured stuff where they get to make choices first. And then if they are, kind of interacting more and seem like they're interested, I might go from the chin rest to like some little scratches under the chin. And then if they seem comfortable with that, I'm probably going to slowly start to do more interactions. But I do like to do kind of consent tests. So I will, pet a little bit, stop, wait and see what the dog does. And if they're coming back into me, I'm going to continue. If they are staying at a distance or moving away, I'm not going to invite them back in. I want to see if they're willing to come back in on their own, unless I know the dog really well and they do well with that. But generally, I'm going to let the dog, 100% be the one that's telling me, do I want to get petted right now, or do I want to just walk away? So those are a few of the things that I use. I definitely also use other cues. So I will use things like a place cue as kind of a safe spot in the house for the dog in some situations. That is generally, again, further down the line. The dog needs to be safe around the people or dogs that we're working with first. But it can create like a safe area where, say, the kids are not allowed to approach the dog, or if there's two dogs in the same household that are fighting, if we can have those dogs go to separate places in the room and hang out, we can all relax a little bit more if they're on opposite sides of the room on their beds, and that's where they kind of hang out for a long time. So there's different options with cues that can be really helpful. I don't, with aggression cases, do a lot of cues like sit. Most of the dogs I work with already know that, so I'm not thinking about those things as much. But I also work with a lot of dogs who are very fearful or anxious, and in those situations, if I'm asking them to like sit and hold it, that can make them feel a lot more trapped sometimes, and they might do it because they want the treat. It's the same thing when I'm working on like treat and retreat or the hand touch and the chin rest. They are, one of the most common mistakes I see is people giving the dogs treats out of their hand to start with. And I have definitely had bites happen that way. Not to me, luckily, but have had students telling me that bites happened that way with their dogs, where the dog was taking treats from someone's hand and then suddenly went and bit. And so what we're doing is we're saying, I want you to do this behavior, and they really want that treat. Maybe they're super treat motivated, but they're not actually comfortable with the behavior. Most dogs, if they're afraid, are not going to want to come up and take a treat from your hand right away. They're going to be a lot more comfortable if you're tossing it behind them. Once they are offering that on their own, then yeah, we can try some treats from hands, but we don't want to do it until they're ready. And it's the same thing with things like sit, down, stay, some of the more common just training basics that we work on. I don't do a ton of those with aggression cases until they have worked through a lot of other stuff. So we are doing super, super simple movements in situations where the dog is reactive on walks. I really talk to them about this in the beginning. I do not want them having their dog sit when the dog or person is approaching that they're scared of. I want them to keep moving in most cases, or if they can't comfortably keep moving, like away, ideally in the beginning, eventually we can be closer. I want them to get off the space, give them as much distance as possible if they have to stop, and I do not want them to make their dog sit, because that is, again, going to make the dog in many situations feel more trapped. So I encourage them instead to put their hand lower on the leash so the dog doesn't have a lot of room to go, and to pretty much shovel treats in their mouth if they have to, if they have no other option, if the dog will take treats. So, I've done different situations where I've taught in really urban, areas where there's lots of sidewalks and people and many, many options, and they can't really walk their dog elsewhere easily if they're in an apartment or something. I've also taught them ways to kind of safely block their dog, where maybe the dog learns, when I give you this cue, you stand against this wall and I'm going to stand in front of you or on the side of you. And usually lots of feeding is going to happen with that. Again, that's a safety thing. I don't teach that to most dogs. It's kind of a situational, like, this is a situation where there is too many of your triggers around for us to manage them for you to feel safe right now, and we have to get you through this somehow. That's not ideal. And in most of those cases, if it's just going for exercise walks, I'm going to tell them, find other ways to exercise your dog. You know, you can definitely exercise your dog, you know, in your apartment. You can exercise your dog in a quieter area. You can load them up in your car and take them to a park that has big open fields at an off time and walk them around. So you have lots of space from everybody. I definitely use those situations, but it's difficult for a lot of people to figure out those options. So I do try to help them set up a specific scenario for those things. And that is something that I do want to kind of talk about in the last, bit here, is I want to talk a little bit about a few specific cases, and then I'll take some questions from you guys if you have some. So you're welcome to pop that in the comments anytime. I'm going to read them at the end and go through some of them. But there have been, I've worked with a lot of dogs at this point in my career. So my main goal is always to kind of look at, first the general setup that I would usually do for the issue that we're working with, and then looking at the dog and their situation and kind of adjusting it to that as I need to. So we'll talk about a couple of little case studies, and I'm just going to give you a name of the dog. I'm not going to give you any other information because these are people that I've asked permission to talk about their dogs, but I don't want to give away any personal information. So the first one I want to talk about here is Gio, who's a German Shepherd. He was a German Shepherd who had been through a couple of homes before he got to his home, which was with a man in his 20s who lived with roommates when he first got Gio. And then he got together with his then wife, and they moved together to an apartment in the city. They were living on a third floor apartment in a very busy area. And Gio was very reactive to dogs and people. He also was really scared of women. So it took him a long time to get used to the wife. And she was pregnant when I went to see them. She was very pregnant. So they were expecting a baby, and they were like, we have to figure this out because we can't even take him out to use the restroom right now without it being a huge ordeal. So they had done some training before I came to them, and part of why I want to talk about this one as well is about shaping clients, because they had gone to a board and train program and come back out of it with some really aversive tools. So when I first met Gio, he was being walked every day on both a pinch collar and an e-collar. And that was how he went to the park with his dad every day to exercise. So that was something that I wanted to get them away from very quickly. I also did not want to make them defensive or offend them on what they had been trying. They'd been trying really hard to help him. That was their goal, was to help him. That from the very beginning. So everything they did was, trying to get in his interest. So we talked about some different options for him, and we talked about why, the e-collar and the pinch collar might be contributing to some of the reactivity. And they were willing to switch. The only problem was that the wife, who was pregnant, did not feel comfortable at all walking him without the pinch collar, because she had to go down 3 flights of stairs to take him to use the restroom, and he pulled really, really, really hard. So what we ended up doing is I did some day training with him, where I would come and take him out during the day while they were working, and I worked on the reactivity, and I worked on leash walking so that he would be a lot easier to get down the stairs. And in the meantime, we looked at some different equipment options for him besides the pinch collar, and I was preferential towards a harness. That's generally my preference. But again, the wife was really insistent that she did not feel comfortable with that. So we decided to try a soft head collar, see how he felt about it. And he was actually really into it. He liked it a lot. He felt very comfortable on it. So we spent some time desensitizing and counter conditioning that. I don't generally use head collars. In this case, I adjusted to the dog because he did not find it aversive. And it made the wife feel a lot more comfortable working with him. So my goal for them eventually was they would be able to walk him on a harness or collar and not have to worry about anything else. He made a ton of progress, especially with dogs right from the beginning. But, there were a couple of setbacks. He had a lot of anxiety, and he was very protective of his space and his toys. So actually, when they were having the baby in the hospital, I came a few times a day to work with him, and a couple times a day to work with him. And one of the times that I came, he got very strange with me, and he'd been really comfortable with me from the beginning. I had never seen any of his fear towards women that they described to me, which even with the wife, he would sometimes pee when she walked into the room, because he would, out of fear, basically. So when I went in this one particular time, I sat on the couch for a minute to ask him to do some things, and he suddenly got very uncomfortable. And after talking to, the dad, he told me that the only bite he'd had was someone sitting on the couch with him. And obviously I was not sitting on the couch with him. He was on the rug near me working on behaviors, and he was doing the behaviors, but I could tell that he was a lot more tense than usual. He was giving me a lot more whale eye. And at one point he actually started to growl. And so I ended up discontinuing what we were doing. I gave him some distance. I moved to a different part of the apartment, and he came over and was significantly more comfortable. So then we had to talk about what's up with the couch. Why is the couch a big trigger for him? So we did work a little bit on some counter conditioning for that, and also they knew that was something to kind of manage in the meantime. So last I heard, he was doing significantly better on walking and reactivity, and doing well with the baby in the home. So he is, he definitely had made a significant amount of progress. He was a lot more confident, and that was the main thing that I was looking at. Was I just didn't want him to be as afraid as he was when he went outside, even inside the house, but especially when he went outside. So we worked on all of the elements that were going on, but the most important thing we did with him, I think, was trying to change his perception from negative to positive. And dogs were a lot easier. People took a little more time, but he did make a significant amount of progress, and they stopped using the pinch collar and the e-collar, which was my goal with them from the beginning. And actually they stopped using it pretty quickly. I think that it had become kind of a crutch for them, in the sense that they felt safer when he had it on, and they had been told by a previous trainer to use it. So when I came in and said, hey, let's do something different, I couldn't just take them from the previous methods to my methods in the first session. It took a couple sessions for me to completely convince them, and a lot of that was through showing them progress without those tools. Showing them that, hey, without these tools, we can definitely make a significant amount of progress, and we can find things that he's going to feel happier about, more relaxed about, and help him be, in a much better situation. So I think they had one other setback when they tried to take him to a patio restaurant, and he did bite a child who reached out to pet him. And so then we had to have another discussion about maybe that's not the best situation for him to go into. But what I loved about that is, as soon as his dad emailed to tell me that, he said, I think I made a mistake bringing him here, and that was too much for him. And so I really appreciated that he had come from this point of, I am going to, basically use these punishment tools to help the dog stop the behavior, to paying attention to what his dog needed and wanted. And that was really a great thing to see. So that's one example. I will give you guys one other example, which is Bandit and Brownie, who were dogs that lived together. So Brownie was a little like Shih Tzu, and Bandit was a Bull Terrier puppy. And Brownie had previously lived with a couple of Bull Terriers, but they had been elderly, and it had been a while. And they brought this new puppy into the house, and their first two introductions did not go well, and resulted in kind of scuffles. No one was hurt, luckily, but the couple that had gotten, Bandit was really concerned about how to introduce the dogs to each other now, and they were keeping them completely separate. And in particular, the wife was really, really scared about what Bandit was going to do to Brownie, because Bandit was so much bigger and so much more intense than Brownie. When I got there, we set up, the first session we didn't actually introduce them. We talked about different things to work on. And the second session when I went, we did introduce them with Bandit on leash behind a baby gate. And the wife felt the most comfortable holding Brownie for that session. So I let her do that. And then we worked on him being on the ground right after. But what I saw was that Bandit was not really that interested in Brownie. He was way more interested in doing training. He was a little bit interested in playing with Brownie, but he definitely was not showing fixation or anything else. And so that was a situation where I kind of had to really look at, to me, this doesn't look like aggression. This looks like an over-exuberant puppy who's a lot bigger than the older dog in the house. But to them, it felt like aggression. And so we treated it in a way where we went really slowly, because even just an over-exuberant puppy can certainly hurt an older, smaller dog. I've had some, seen some very tragic situations with that. So we went really, really slowly. We basically worked with Bandit as if he was reactive to Brownie, and the same with Brownie, because Brownie would, talk back a little bit too, because he was scared. He didn't really want to be involved in that. And we worked them behind the baby gate. We started working them on leash together, and every single time that I went, we saw progress. And within a few, I think it was about 4 sessions, we were able to walk them together in the living room, which is where they had fought before, and have them relax in the same space together, right next to each other. And they were, thrilled with that point. So they continued to very slowly introduce them, but things did get a lot better. And luckily they had a large house where they could have like a room that was like just Bandit stuff, like where his crate was and where all of his fun things were, that had access to the big yard. And like the living room could be Brownie's, and then they could bring them together when they were able to supervise. So I thought that was an interesting one, mostly because a lot of it was about the perception that was happening there. And when we did first try to introduce the dogs through the baby gate, you could tell that the wife and then the daughter was there home from college that time. Both of them got scared at one point when Bandit kind of made a noise, I think. And so a lot of it was also about them understanding that what he was doing was not because he wanted to hurt Brownie, but because he was just overstimulated. He was really excited and exuberant. So that was, a good thing for us to kind of look at and work on. And then just really briefly, I'll talk about Lobo, who's a little Frenchie that I worked with, and he was awesome. I spent a lot of time with Lobo. I've actually gone and dog sat for him a few times when his family's out of town, because no one else can stay with him. And Lobo is a kind of extreme eater of things that shouldn't be eaten, as well as a resource guarder. So there had been several bites to people in the family because they had tried to take toilet paper rolls away from him, paper towels, random items that generally are not things that we want them to eat. And so there were some trips to the ER or the doctor from pretty good bites on their hands. So that was their biggest concern. He also had some reactivity to dogs and people, so generally wasn't going on walks. So he had a backyard, which was lovely, but they did feel like they needed to have him on leash in the backyard because he had escaped once and run out and barked at people. So they were very, an excellent family for him, really loved him, really wanted to work with him. The other element, which ended up being the biggest thing, was that at a certain time of evening, they would call it his witching hour, where they would try to go and sit in the living room, and Lobo would just start barking, growling, mouthing hard, and humping. And all of those things would happen, and really it was, I witnessed it when I stayed with him, and it was really intense. I definitely, found it to be out of the ordinary levels of extremely hard mouthing, more like a bite than a mouthing, that kind of was paired with what almost looked like play, but was at a super, super high intensity level. And then there was, grab onto your leg and start to, mount, and he would also just sit there and bark and growl at you and bark and bark and bark and bark. So we worked on the relaxation protocol. That was a huge thing for him. We worked on some Zen exercises where he was rewarded for looking away from what he wanted. We worked on a really strong drop cue, and we worked on some resource guarding, counter conditioning, and really it was a difficult situation because they were in a place where they were in a fairly fairly busy area, but a little bit tucked up in a townhouse, so they did have close neighbors, so taking him outside was difficult. And they also were really having trouble with him with themselves, and they had 2 young sons who were starting to get to the age where they would be moving around a lot more and doing a lot more stuff that could potentially trigger Lobo. So we saw tons of progress. Lobo was really, really, really into treats, so that helped a lot. And we were able to get some really solid behaviors, really solid, being able to churn away from things that were, we didn't want him to eat, being able to drop things, being able to trade when needed, and then starting to work on some of the reactivity as well. But I spent, because I was able to do that dog sitting with him, I spent a lot of time with him during his witching hour, where I was able to really work on relaxation. We did use a little bit of a tether in that situation a couple of times. I just took a long leash and attached it to the furniture so that he had plenty of space to move around the living room, but if he did get really intense, I could move away to avoid getting injured, basically. So that was just a safety setup. He had tons of extra room. He was really a very long tether, and he was super comfortable and could still come up on the couch and relax and do what he usually did. So lots of progress there as well. But again, those are just kind of 3 cases that I wanted to talk about, because I think that they all have kind of their own unique little things that are related to aggression, but maybe are not things that we, traditionally have to deal with in a lot of our cases. So those are just examples, but they are some ones that I've found to be interesting. So with that, I'm going to kind of wrap up here, but I do want to answer any questions that you guys have. So I see 1 or 2 in the comments, but if you have one, feel free to go ahead and put that in, and I will make sure to answer those before you finish. So let me see. Okay, so Lauren asked, how do you balance using toys or movement as a reinforcement with the increase in arousal these things usually bring? Usually increase in arousal isn't useful around a trigger, I assume. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's a very big option, big issue for a lot of dogs if they are at that overstimulated place. I use it more with dogs who are a little more shut down, who are, not quite as over aroused. But I will say there have been some dogs I've worked with who were at a really high arousal level who have used it to kind of redirect into better behaviors. And then we've also worked on going quickly in between play and like a calm behavior. So I've had a few dogs that I've worked with who we did sessions where all we did was, play a little tug or a little bit of fetch, and then immediately have them do like a sit or a down, and then go back into playing, and then immediately go back into a sit or a down. And again, very briefly, they were able to get up as fast as they wanted to, but just kind of getting in this like switch between I'm super excited and aroused to I can be calm. And just going back and forth between that in a comfortable situation where they weren't going to feel trapped or scared. That was definitely something that, that I was thinking about with them. So it's not easy. It's definitely not right for every dog. If it's making anything worse, then we're definitely not going to keep doing it. But there are some dogs who I have found it to be really useful for. Okay, and then Alexis mentioned nose work, tug, flirt pull, and door agility, lots of options. I'm assuming that's about not taking walks. Yes, all of those. I like all of those things. Meredith asks, with Geo and Lobo, how are you able to feel comfy with the dogs being around young kids, the family we're having? Yeah, that's a really good question, and we talked a lot about safety in those situations. Luckily, they were both pretty vigilant. Lobo's family had baby gates up everywhere, like all the doors. Lobo was not allowed upstairs. That was the kids' play area also, and so it was a very managed environment. But they still do understand that there is a risk there, and we do talk about that. And I'm really strict about talking about safety with kids, and the ways, never having your child unsupervised with your dog. For some of the dogs, I might recommend muzzling when the child is young, especially when they're going to be together, even supervised. But I definitely really emphasize the safety there, and there have been situations where I have recommended that the dog be maybe rehomed because the kids were just not a safe fit for that dog. And then do you combine lat with bat? So I kind of Not exactly. So I definitely use Look at That more than I use BAT. I've used BAT some, but I am not an expert in BAT. I definitely think it's a good method that works for a lot of people really well. I just haven't. That's just not one that has come up for me quite as often, but I have used it a little bit with some dogs. And then Laura asks, with the GSD in an apartment building, what exercises did you do to help the owners manage him inside the building and on the stairs? We did the here cue. We did a redirection cue. We also did some engage, disengage on the walks, and I worked with him on walking up and down the stairs in a heel. And really specifically, what I would do is, as I was going up and down the stairs, if we saw a person at any distance or a dog at any distance, I would do the here cue. He would get something amazing. We'd go back to walking. And really, I can only think of maybe one time with me that he had a reaction on the stairs. Generally, I was able to manage him very well, but I did understand that might be different when I wasn't there. So I did give them, a lot of, that's part of why we ended up using the head halter at first. But also, that was really a lot for a feeling of comfort for them too. With me, I never really had an issue with it. I could walk him on even just a regular collar, and sometimes we would do that in a heel position quite frequently. There were times that he was more distracted, like any dog, but it actually worked quite well. And inside the apartment, he didn't really show any aggression towards them, except that he showed fearful behavior with the wife. So, and a little bit of resource guarding with them, but nothing that had resulted in a bite to them. His only bite before I started working with them was to, I believe, the man's father, on the couch with him, but it was to the neck. So that was really concerning. So luckily everyone was okay in that situation, but we did talk a lot about, maybe if someone's going to be on the couch with you, he shouldn't be in the room. And maybe, we need to make sure a muzzle's on when visitors are over, or he's up, things like that, definitely. Meredith asked, do you feel your day training can cause more buy-in from clients? Sometimes yes. I like doing day training as part of this when the dog is comfortable with me. If the dog is not comfortable with me, then we're going to work with privates for a while first until they are. I had one situation where I started day training with the clients and we'd only done 1 or 2 sessions before, and the dogs were fine with me, with the client there, but as soon as I came on my own, they were like, we're not letting you put our collar and leash on, we're not going outside. So most of our first day training session had to be me working on getting their collars on and their leashes on, and after that we had them with their collars and harnesses kind of on in advance and set up to be safe. But yes, day training could be a great option, because when you are working with them, you can frequently see faster results if you're doing a lot more repetitions, and I think that it really can be super helpful. Not every client's able to afford that, but I do like to use it as part of the protocol when I can. Okay, so I think we're about out of time, and I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to wrap up. Thank you guys for coming and talking to me, and I hope that whether you're watching this live or you're watching it later, that you got something out of it, and you enjoy the rest of this wonderful free conference.